A major problem that most of us have with gardening is weeds. However much we carefully tend the borders, rogue greeneries appears. And even in a lawn, before too long, you can end up with the grass being interspersed with the odd dandelion or buttercup. How does it happen? In most cases, it is the common act of seed dispersal. The wind or birds spread the unwanted seeds. Some even have underground runners. That's more insidious than ever. But for the most part, it's just one of those things. We just have to get down and pull them out. Or maybe use a hoe. There's no malicious intent behind it all. It just happens. The parable that Jesus tells is an agricultural story. On one level, it's quite simple, but the more you look at it, the more complex it gets. It features the sowing of a field of wheat. But things are not as straightforward as that because the seed has become contaminated. Someone, an enemy, has sowed weed seeds. In older translations, they're referred to as tares. They are probably a weed called darnel. Now, in the early days, it's very hard to tell darnel and wheat apart. It's only later, when the plants are about to mature and the seed heads form, that they can be distinguished. But the other problem is that darnel has stronger roots than wheat. It threatens to choke the wheat, yet the act of pulling it out means that the wheat comes with it. So we have a problem. The workers in the field have become edgy as they wonder what to do. Where did the bad seeds come from? Did the householder even sow good seeds in the first place? The solution, as Jesus suggests, is to wait until the harvest comes. Then the owner will separate the wheat from the weeds. The parable can operate on a number of levels. Firstly, we can look at how it applies to the work of Jesus himself. The work that he does, the message that he delivers is pure, yet he receives constant rejection. In that respect, he is like the wheat. Those that oppose him, that threaten to crowd out the message, are symbolized by the weeds. What this tells us is, despite the rejection, there is nothing wrong with Jesus' message. The second way of looking at it is to look at the church. The church, the people of God, are frequently addressed in Matthew's Gospel, as Matthew writes to his audience with guidance informed by the authority of Christ. It's no secret that the church is, as then, composed of a multitude of people with different needs and aspirations, competing attitudes and motivations. In fact, I suspect it could be true of each of us as individuals. Matthew is just writing to his congregation and suggesting that there is, metaphorically speaking, wheat and weeds amongst them. The reality is that churches contain good and bad, just the same as anywhere else. In fact, most of us are made up of both wheat and weed. But that immediately raises questions. It might be possible to decide who are the wheat and who are the weeds. But who is it that does so? And what are the criteria? And then what happens next? If the church leadership were to decide that someone is classed as weeds, how do they remove them? Is the collateral damage too high? The interpretation of Jesus' parable gives us insights. Though there have been instances of abuse, greed, hatred, and selfishness in churches, this is not ordained by God. Just because that seems to be in the church at its worst, it doesn't mean that it is God's will. Far from it. But the good news from the church's point of view is that it's not up to the church to decide. And this leads on to the third main point. Nobody has to play God and set things right themselves. The slaves in the parable are panicking because they think they will have to fix things for themselves. But the reality is that they are encouraged to leave the weeds growing alongside the wheat in the field. They are also spared the task of distinguishing which is which. But the owner is confident that the weeds will not succeed in choking out the wheat, and the harvest will ultimately be successful. Of course, that also leads on to the whole idea of a final judgment, something that opens up a lot of other questions, some of which are answered later in Matthew's Gospel. But suffice it to say here that we worship a just, loving and merciful God. If you look elsewhere in Matthew's Gospel, it's clear that the church is not expected to ignore or collude with corruption in its ranks. Rather, the success of the kingdom does not rely on the total purity of the church. Instead, the church can be confident of its goal, not panicking and turning in on itself, instead being sure that ultimately it's God's will which will prevail. But for us, ourselves, what do we want to be? Wheat or weed? That's the challenge for each of us to decide.